A WarDog attacked an officer and was sentenced to die. But when Arthur Bennett, a retired canine rescuer turned small-town realtor, looked into its terrified eyes, he saw the partner he lost 15 years ago. What came next wasn't about saving a dog. It was about saving himself. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The morning frost of Dry Creek clung to every pine needle like dusted glass. The world was still, save for the faint scrape of boots over the wooden porch of a small real estate office that looked more like a cabin than a place of business. Inside, the air carried the scent of pine resin and burnt coffee. The iron stove whispered and popped, its orange eye half shut, throwing thin shadows across old framed maps of properties long sold and long forgotten. Arthur Bennett sat at his desk, a tall, lean man with a frame hardened by years of fire and smoke. At 61, he bore the quiet gravity of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little about it. His hair, salt and iron gray, was neatly combed back, though the morning's mist had already given it a wild edge. Lines had carved themselves deep around his eyes the color of worn steel, steady and searching, as if always gauging the distance to something he couldn't yet see. He moved slowly, methodically, like a craftsman. Every motion, pouring the coffee, sorting through paperwork, tapping a pen against a notepad, seemed deliberate, as if his body still remembered the disciplined rhythm of command. But beneath that stillness, there was a weight. Guilt, heavy as soot on a firefighter's gear, never truly scrubbed clean. Across the wooden floor padded Duke, his German shepherd, 8 years old, massive yet graceful, coat a mix of tan and black, eyes bright amber that caught every flicker of light. The right ear had a small tear near the edge, an old wound that had healed into character. Duke's gait was measured, unhurried, the gait of a creature that had learned patience by watching its master too long. Arthur looked up from his desk. "Cold one today, huh, partner?" Duke's tail brushed the floor once. Acknowledgement, not excitement. He sat beside the desk, the way soldiers used to stand by their captains, and tilted his head at the window. Outside, the frost was lifting off the dirt road that wound down toward town. Dry Creek wasn't much. A post office, a diner that hadn't changed its menu since the 80s, and a single gas pump that squeaked like an old harmonica. Most of Arthur's clients were retirees or widows looking for smaller houses, warmer winters, and a little peace. He had a talent for finding homes that felt safe, as one of his customers had once said. It wasn't about the price, the square footage, or the view. It was about whether you could breathe inside those walls without feeling the ghosts of yesterday pressing close. He leaned back, staring at the property photos pinned to the corkboard. Cabins, cottages, trailers, even an abandoned orchard house. Each one was quiet, windless, like him. He rubbed his temple. There were mornings when the quiet felt like a blessing, and then there were mornings like this, when the silence roared. In the distance, a siren wailed, one long, lonely note cutting through the valley. Arthur froze, his hand tightening around the coffee mug. It wasn't the sound itself that hurt. It was the reflex it woke. The echo of another siren, many years ago, over a desert base half a world away. He saw it again. The explosion, the dust, the radio static, and the command he'd shouted that never should have been given. K9 advance, sector clear. Then the flash. The silence that followed had been longer than any siren since. He swallowed hard and forced his breath to slow. Duke nudged his knee gently, reading the tremor in his hand. "I'm fine," Arthur murmured, though the words came out dry. just old ghosts knocking around. He put on his jacket, dark canvas, oil-finished, worn at the elbows, and whistled softly. Duke stood, alert and ready. "Come on, boy. We've got oil to deliver before the snow's back." The truck, a faded green Ford from another lifetime, coughed awake and rattled down the road. The heater didn't work, but the air smelled clean, like thawing pine and cold earth. They passed the diner, Martha's place, where a plump woman with silver curls and rosy cheeks wiped down the counter with the same cloth she'd been using since 1985. Martha Lee waved through the window, and Arthur lifted a hand back, a small smile tugging the corner of his mouth. "Same people, same coffee, same pie," he muttered. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Duke woofed once, low and amused. The road dipped and curved past a frozen creek, then up toward the outskirts of town. On his right, half hidden behind a chain-link fence and a crooked wooden sign, stood the county animal rescue station. A few trucks were parked outside, exhaust curling in the cold. Arthur slowed the Ford instinctively. He hadn't been near that place in months, not since the last time he'd donated old blankets and kibble. Something about animal shelters always tugged at him. Maybe it was the smell of fear and hope mixed together, the same scent he remembered from military kennels long ago. Then it came. A metallic crash, sharp as a gunshot, followed by frantic barking. Then a scream, not human, not fully animal either, raw, panicked, primal. Duke's ears shot up. Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The noise came again, the sound of metal striking concrete, of claws scraping, of something large trying to escape. A man's voice yelled out, angry, desperate. "Get back! Damn it, get back!" Duke barked once, sharp and urgent. Arthur hesitated. He looked at the time. He was already late for the oil delivery. The client, an elderly woman named Mrs. Keller, depended on that heat before dusk. But something in his chest twisted tight, a feeling he hadn't let rule him for years. The last time he'd followed that instinct, it had ended in loss. The last time he'd rushed in had cost him a dog and a piece of his own soul. He turned off the ignition. "Stay," he told Duke. The dog didn't move, just stared at him through the glass, eyes burning gold in the cold light. Arthur stepped out into the wind. The gravel crunched under his boots. The metallic clatter from inside the station grew louder, followed by a man shouting, "We're done! He's gone feral! Put him down!" Arthur's pace quickened. He reached the gate, pushed it open, and stepped into the yard. Two men stood near a holding cage. One, David, the animal control officer, was in his 30s, sturdy, square-jawed, face flushed from the cold and frustration. His right sleeve was torn, blood soaking the fabric beneath. "He bit me through the damn glove," David barked at the older man beside him. "We should have ended this yesterday." The older man, Jared, tall and wiry with gray in his beard and the calm eyes of someone used to chaos, said nothing at first. He just held a clipboard like a shield. "He's scared," Jared muttered finally. "Not vicious. There's a difference." David spat on the ground. "Tell that to my arm." Arthur glanced past them toward the source of the chaos. Inside the cage, a German shepherd, larger than Duke, younger. Coat a silver-gray sheen under the harsh lights, paced in a tight circle. The dog's eyes were wild, whites showing, ears pinned. Saliva foamed at the corner of its mouth, not from madness, but panic. For a moment, Arthur saw flashes, metal kennels, desert sand, the scent of blood and gasoline. He recognized the look instantly. PTSD in canine form. Not rage, fear sharpened into survival. "Who is he?" Arthur asked quietly. David turned, surprised. "Who the hell are you?" "Arthur Bennett, Realtor. Used to work search and rescue and canine recovery." He kept his voice steady, non-threatening, the way you'd talk to a wounded animal. "Mind if I take a look?" Jared hesitated, studying Arthur. "You trained rescue dogs?" "Trained with them. Lived with them." Arthur's eyes drifted to the cage. "Sometimes died with them." A long pause. Then Jared nodded once. "Go ahead, but stay clear of the bars." Arthur moved slowly, ungloved hands open at his sides. The shepherd froze, tail rigid, chest heaving. The air in the room was thick, hot breath, metal, and fear. Arthur stopped 5 feet from the cage. "Easy there," he murmured. "No one's gonna hurt you." He didn't reach out. He just pulled a small wooden stool, a 3-legged thing used to hold feed buckets, and set it down quietly. Then he sat. The dog's eyes tracked him, hackles up. Arthur didn't look directly into them. Eye contact was challenge. Instead, he turned his gaze to the far wall, breathing slow and even. His heartbeat steadied. After a while, so did the dogs. Behind him, Duke gave a low whine from the truck outside, a sound like a hum of reassurance through the thin walls. The gray shepherd's ears twitched, caught it, and for the first time in hours, or maybe days, it stopped pacing. Jared exhaled quietly. "Well, I'll be damned," David scoffed, clutching his bandaged arm. "You'll be damned when that thing lunges again. I'm not sticking around to watch it tear another arm off." Arthur didn't answer. He stayed still, eyes half-lidded, listening to the rhythm of breath between man and dog. The shepherd's chest rose slower now, its paws settling on the concrete like it had remembered the ground was solid. Then, out of nowhere, the metal light fixture above them flickered. The bulb buzzed, a faint pop echoing through the quiet. The shepherd flinched, body tensing, but instead of barking, it backed up into the corner and sat. Arthur's pulse jumped. That sit wasn't random. It was trained, automatic, disciplined. He turned slightly, meeting Jared's eye. "He's not wild," Arthur said softly. "He's military." And then, before anyone could speak, the dog gave a sound. Not a growl, not a whine, something between the two. A sound Arthur hadn't heard since a war zone. The kind of sound a K9 makes when it recognizes a voice it once obeyed. Arthur's breath caught mid-chest. "Impossible," he whispered. But the dog's gaze didn't waver. Outside, the siren that had started his morning began to wail again, long and low through the cold air, just as Duke barked once from the truck, sharp and commanding. The gray shepherd's ears twitched, its body trembling. But it didn't break eye contact. And for the first time in 15 years, Arthur Bennett felt the world tilt back toward the fire. The wind outside the rescue station had quieted, though its chill still clung to the air like a warning that refused to leave. Inside, the metal scent of disinfectant mixed with fear. The gray-white shepherd paced in circles, claws scraping against concrete, each breath a stuttered plea for escape. The dog's flanks shivered as if bracing for invisible gunfire. Arthur Bennett stood motionless, his eyes studying the rhythm of the creature's panic, the way a medic might study a failing pulse. He recognized it. The tremor in the chest, the jerky scanning of the ceiling, the way the ears pinned flat, not from aggression, but from trained alertness. This was no wild stray. This was a soldier still stuck in the battlefield. David, the animal control officer, leaned against the wall, his bloodied bandage already seeping through. His face was flushed, a mix of pain and humiliation. "We can't keep him, Jared," he growled. "He's dangerous. You saw what he did." Jared, the rescue station's director, rubbed the back of his neck, his weathered face caught between reason and mercy. At 55, he was lean, with sun-browned skin and soft gray eyes that carried years of dealing with both beasts and broken people. "He's scared, not rabid," Jared said quietly. "I've seen worse turn around. You just have to reach them the right way." David scoffed. "You sound like one of those TV trainers. The right way's a needle." Arthur broke his silence. His voice was low, calm, steady, the tone of a man who had given too many orders under fire. "No. The right way's time." David turned sharply. "Who put you in charge, old man?" Arthur didn't answer. He simply moved toward the far wall, eyes on the floor rather than the cage. Then, as if remembering something half buried in instinct, he reached for a small wooden stool by the supply rack, a simple three-legged thing with paint peeling at the edges. He set it down 10 paces from the cage and sat. The room stilled. "Don't get closer," David snapped. Arthur didn't even glance his way. "I won't. I'll just sit." He exhaled slowly, the way he used to before sending a K9 into smoke. He didn't look directly at the dog. Eye contact now would be a challenge, not an invitation. Instead, he fixed his gaze on a rusted pipe near the floor, breathing in through his nose, out through his mouth. Slow, even, deliberate. Behind him, Duke lay down near the doorway, chin on his paws. The older shepherd's amber eyes never left the cage. Every few seconds, Duke gave a low, rhythmic sigh, as if reminding the trembling creature across the room how to breathe. At first, nothing changed. The gray-white shepherd, mud-streaked, ribs visible under the coat, kept pacing, circles tightening. But then one of its ears twitched toward Duke's sound. Its breathing slowed by a fraction. It stopped long enough to lift its head, nostrils flaring, scenting the air that now carried something, faintly familiar, calm. Arthur spoke, not to command, but to fill the silence gently. "You don't have to fight the ghosts, son. They're already gone." David muttered something under his breath, but Jared shushed him. The air felt fragile, as if a single loud word might shatter the progress unfolding in front of them. A side door creaked open. The smell of fresh coffee drifted in, along with the soft shuffle of boots. Grace Whitman entered. Tall for a woman, slender, wrapped in a gray cardigan and scarf the color of dried lavender. Her hair, silver-threaded chestnut, was pinned back loosely, and her face, though kind, carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much loss to expect miracles. Grace had been a nurse for 30 years before retirement, and for the last 2, she volunteered at the shelter, tending to the animals no one else could touch. She stopped short when she saw Arthur sitting cross-legged on the stool, his eyes half closed, his breath steady as a metronome. "What's going on?" she whispered to Jared. "Arthur Bennett," Jared murmured back. "Says he used to work K9 rescue. The shepherd's got combat trauma, he says." Grace's gaze softened as she looked from Arthur to the gray dog. "Poor soul," she murmured. "Both of them." She set a steaming paper cup on the table beside Arthur. Coffee. Still hot. Arthur nodded slightly, never turning his head. Thank you, ma'am. She smiled faintly. Name's Grace, and you don't have to call me ma'am. I'm not that old yet. Her tone carried a gentle humor, and for the first time that morning, the tension in the room thinned. Jared allowed himself a slow exhale. Even David shifted uneasily, looking from Grace to Arthur as if realizing he might be witnessing something beyond his comprehension. Arthur flipped open a small, weather-worn book in his lap. Its pages were yellowed and soft from years of use. The spine read, Training Notes, K9 Division 42. He began to read softly, not the words themselves, but the rhythm, the quiet cadence of a Mwok speaking to himself more than anyone else. The shepherd froze mid-step, head tilting. Its ears flicked forward. The pacing stopped. Arthur didn't look up. He just turned a page, kept breathing, kept reading. Duke lifted his head slightly, tail brushing once against the floor. Easy, Arthur murmured, voice almost inaudible. You're all right now. You're home. For a long while, the only sound was the breathing of 3 men, 1 woman, and 2 dogs syncing to the same rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The storm within the gray shepherd ebbed, little by little. Then came a sound, soft, tentative, the shepherd's paw stepping forward. Another step, then another, its nose pressed lightly against the bars, nostrils flaring toward Arthur's boot. Arthur's heart tightened, though his face didn't change. He lifted one hand, palm open, and placed it gently against the air between them. Good boy, he whispered. David cursed quietly. This is insane. Jared shook his head. No, this is something else. Grace watched, her hand on her chest. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Something about Arthur's composure struck her, a stillness she'd only ever seen in people who had stood too close to loss. When the shepherd finally sat, shoulders trembling but eyes no longer wild, Grace stepped forward and crouched beside Arthur. He's listening to you, she said softly. Arthur nodded. He remembers structure. That's good. Means he's not gone. Grace's eyes lingered on the old stool, its paint cracked, one leg slightly shorter than the rest, wobbling whenever Arthur shifted his weight. You always carry that stool around for this kind of work? Arthur gave the ghost of a smile. Nah. Found it here. Just seemed like the right height for waiting. Waiting for what? She asked. He hesitated. For him to breathe right again. For me too, maybe. There was a pause. Then Grace said quietly, I used to have a dog like that. His name was Jasper. He was old and gentle and thought thunder was the end of the world. What happened? She looked away. Cancer. He went fast. My husband. Slower. Arthur's eyes flicked toward her. He didn't offer condolences, only silence, the kind that understood. Grace gave a small nod, as if accepting it as enough. Minutes passed. The shepherd's breathing steadied, slow and deep now, mirroring Duke's from across the room. The danger had receded like a tide. Jared finally spoke, voice low. Arthur, I don't know what you just did, but it worked. He hasn't been that calm since we brought him in. Arthur stood slowly, knees popping. Don't thank me yet. Panic's like fire. It dies down when you smother it, but it'll flare again unless you find the fuel and clear it out. David muttered, And what if the fuel is in his head? Arthur looked at the dog, whose eyes followed him with fragile trust. Then you teach him how to live with the smoke. Grace smiled faintly at that, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and warmth. Jared scribbled something on his clipboard. We'll need to log this session. You think you can come back tomorrow? Arthur hesitated. I'm not a volunteer. You are now, Grace said, handing him another cup of coffee. We pay in caffeine and company. Arthur took it, his hand brushing hers, a fleeting moment, but one that left both of them a little less guarded. Outside, Duke barked once, signaling the hour like an old church bell. The wind had picked up again, whispering through the pines. Arthur glanced back at the gray shepherd, who had finally lain down, head resting on its paws, eyes half closed but still watching him. He bent down and said softly, "We'll get you out of here, soldier. Just breathe." As he turned to leave, Grace followed him out into the cold morning. "What are you going to call him?" she asked. Arthur looked toward the horizon, where the frost was turning gold under the first hint of sun. "Not sure yet," he said, "but I think he already knows my voice." Behind them, from the dim light of the rescue station, the shepherd let out a low, quiet sound, a whine, half recognition, half plea, followed by a single sharp bark that made Grace flinch. Arthur stopped mid-step, his breath fogging in the air. "You hear that?" he said softly. Grace nodded. "What does it mean?" Arthur's face darkened slightly. "It means he's remembering." And the wind carried the sound of that single bark across Dry Creek like an echo from another lifetime. The morning light slanted through the grimy rescue station windows, catching dust in slow motion, like ash suspended in the air after a long fire. The world outside was cold but bright, snow melting into thin streams along the dirt road. Inside, however, tension lingered thick as smoke. Arthur Bennett stood beside the cage where the gray-white shepherd, now calmer, though still coiled with wary energy, watched him with eyes sharp as mirrors. Grace Whitman moved quietly through the cluttered office, a stack of disorganized papers in her hands. Her face was pale from the chill, but her movements were precise, practiced. Those of a woman who had once worked in hospitals, sorting life from death through neat handwriting and calm hands. "Whoever filed these," she murmured, "had no idea what order means." Jared, the station director, leaned against the doorway, coffee mug in hand, his weathered features drawn in fatigue. "That'd be David," he said with a tired smirk. "Paperwork's not his art. He's more of a slam the door, curse the world kind of guy." David wasn't in the room, but his presence still lingered, the sound of his frustration from earlier, the faint metallic echo of his boots, the blood-stained bandage that had landed in the trash bin like an accusation. Grace set the papers down on the table, and one thin folder slid free, falling open across the surface. A small plastic tag clattered out, attached to a faded string. "What's this?" she asked softly. Arthur stepped closer, wiping the grime off the tag with his thumb. Embedded inside was a small metallic bead, a microchip capsule, the kind used by the military. He frowned. "That's not a shelter chip. That's restricted issue." Grace blinked. "Restricted." "Military working dog," Arthur said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "MWD identification." Jared looked up. "You're saying this dog's government property?" "Was," Arthur corrected. Not anymore. Not if he's here. Grace opened the folder completely, her fingers trembling as she read. Inside was a crumpled discharge form. Unit Shadow, Multitask K9, retired from service June of last year. Below the printed type, someone had scrawled in blue ink, released for adoption. Handler unavailable. Grace's brow furrowed. Shadow, she whispered. That's his name. Arthur's chest tightened. He looked at the shepherd, Shadow, who lifted his head at the sound, ears twitching, gaze locked. You remember that, don't you? Arthur said softly. The dog blinked once, then stood. Arthur took a breath and spoke the words like muscle memory. Sits. Shadow's body lowered instantly, hindquarters to the ground. Arthur's pulse quickened. He continued. Platz. The shepherd dropped flat against the floor, chin down, eyes up, waiting. And then, one final command. Bleib. The dog froze, perfectly still. Grace gasped. Jared set his coffee down hard enough that it sloshed over the rim. Jesus, he muttered. He's trained to the bone. Arthur nodded slowly, but his jaw tightened. Trained to follow orders, no matter what they cost him. A silence followed, long, uneasy. Then David burst through the side door, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete. His face was pale from the morning cold, his arm newly bandaged and stiff at the elbow. You're all wasting time, he snapped. That animal's not fit for civilian custody. Grace turned, her calm tone carrying steel beneath it. He's not dangerous, David. He's traumatized. David barked a sharp laugh. That's what they all say, right before someone else gets bit. I've seen this before. He held up his arm. This isn't my first scar. 2 years ago, a pit rescue snapped and tore a boy's leg. I vouched for it, said it just needed patience. Guess what? The town sued the shelter. I lost my insurance, my rank, and the kid walks with a brace now. You don't come back from mistakes like that. His voice cracked slightly at the edge, revealing a bitterness that wasn't pure anger. It was fear. Arthur's eyes softened. I'm sorry that happened, but this isn't the same. Doesn't matter, David shot back. The county doesn't care about stories. They care about risk. I already filed an aggression report. Jared's head snapped up. You what? Level 4, David said, pulling a yellow form from his jacket and slapping it onto the table. Protocol requires documentation after an officer injury. The insurance kicks in and the county board gets notified automatically. Grace picked up the paper. Level 4 means euthanasia pending review, Arthur finished grimly. David folded his arms. He's got 7 days. If he can't be handled, muzzle on, leash attached, walked out without incident, he's done. The board's not going to risk a lawsuit for a retired soldier. Grace's hands shook. That's not fair. David's eyes, shadowed by old pain, didn't flinch. Fair's not part of policy. The silence that followed was so complete it could have frozen breath. Even Shadow, as if sensing the shift, stood quietly in his cage, head low, eyes darting from face to face. Duke, lying near the door, gave a low rumble in his throat. Not a threat, but something between warning and protest. Arthur knelt beside him, laying a steady hand on his fur. Easy, boy. We'll fix this. Jared rubbed his temples. If that report's filed, the clock's already ticking. I can't stop it. Arthur straightened slowly. Then I'll prove he's safe. David snorted. You're not licensed. Arthur's gaze hardened. No. But I trained with K9 units before you even wore a badge. I know their language better than any clipboard. Jared stepped in, his voice firm. Arthur, this isn't just about training. The board will want evidence. Video proof, behavioral charting. Grace, can you help with that? Grace nodded immediately. I can record his sessions, document progress. If there's improvement, maybe we can appeal. David shook his head. You'll waste your time. They'll never clear a combat K9 for civilian adoption again. Arthur's tone dropped to a quiet command. Then they'll have to clear him for redemption. The look in his eyes made even David fall silent. Hours passed. By midday, the sun had melted most of the frost outside. Inside, Arthur stayed near the cage, reading softly again from the old training manual. Grace brought him coffee and sandwiches she'd bought from Martha's diner. Jared came and went, making calls to the county office, trying to slow the paperwork train already in motion. David lingered near the doorway, watching in silence, his skepticism warring with curiosity. By late afternoon, the first test began. Arthur stood 5 feet from the cage. Duke lay calmly near the far corner, his slow breathing steadying the air. Shadow shifted, restless, paws tapping once against the floor. Arthur held a short leash in his hand, the kind used for K9 drills. He didn't move closer yet. All right, soldier, he said softly. You've followed commands before. You can follow them again. No one's here to hurt you. Grace filmed quietly from behind the wire partition. Arthur took a step closer. Sits. Shadow obeyed instantly. Another step. Plots. The dog hesitated, then dropped down, muscles tense but controlled. Arthur's voice softened, almost a whisper. Bleib. The dog froze again, eyes locked on him. For a moment, the room felt suspended, every breath, every heartbeat waiting for something to break. Then, from outside, the distant rumble of a garbage truck shattered the stillness. The metal crash of its bin slammed against the morning's fragile peace. Shadow bolted upright, snarling, eyes wild again. The leash slipped from Arthur's hand as the dog slammed against the cage bars with a force that rattled bolts. Arthur! Grace gasped. Duke barked once, loud and sharp, a thunderclap of authority. Shadow stopped mid-lunge, panting, trembling, ears flicking toward the sound. Arthur raised a hand, voice steady. Shadow Platz. The dog hesitated, chest heaving, then lowered himself again, muscles trembling. Arthur exhaled slowly. Good boy. Grace stopped recording, her hands shaking. That could have gone bad. Arthur nodded. But it didn't. David stepped forward, lips pressed thin. One wrong sound, and he'll kill someone. You think the board's gonna ignore that? Arthur looked at him evenly. I think fear isn't the same as danger. And I think he deserves the same 7 days I got once, to prove I was still worth keeping alive. David froze, caught off guard by the quiet confession. Arthur walked toward the door, Duke following at his side. He paused only once, glancing back at the cage where Shadow lay down again, eyes following him. Not wild this time, but waiting. Grace watched them both, something fragile sparking behind her tired eyes. Outside, the sun dipped low, staining the snowmelt gold. 7 days. 7 chances. And somewhere inside that cage, a soldier's heart began to beat a little steadier again, though the world had already signed his death notice. By the third dawn, the frost on the shelter's fence no longer glittered, but clung like dull scars. Arthur Bennett sat again on the same three-legged stool, its wood now worn by the press of his weight, its legs dug faintly into the concrete floor. The gray-white shepherd, Shadow, watched him from the pen, eyes flicking between the man's calm stillness and the object held in his hand. A long training stick with a soft leather muzzle dangling from its end. It was empty, harmless. Yet for Shadow, it was the echo of something that once meant restraint and pain. Arthur spoke in the same low timbre as before, steady as a metronome. "It's all right, soldier. Just a tool, not a cage." He extended the stick slowly through the mesh. The leather muzzle hung halfway between them, smelling faintly of new oil and liver treats. Duke, lying near the doorway, lifted his head but did not move. The older shepherd's amber eyes observed like a quiet sergeant evaluating a recruit. Grace Whitman watched from a corner of the kennel hall, her wool scarf wrapped tight. Her face, though pale with fatigue, held a soft light of belief that calm could heal what force could not. She had cleaned the place that morning, mopped the floor, and even placed a small paper cup of coffee beside Arthur's boot. "Shadow," Arthur whispered. "Come on now, smell it." The gray shepherd stepped forward a single inch, nostrils flaring. His paws made no sound, but his breathing betrayed him, fast, uneven. When the muzzle brushed his nose, he jerked back, whining softly. Arthur did not move, did not speak. He simply inhaled and exhaled, slow and measured. After several heartbeats, the dog crept forward again. This time he sniffed longer. Then, with the faintest flick of his tongue, he touched the leather edge. A small tremor passed through his shoulders. Arthur didn't smile. He simply said, "Good." Duke's ears shifted back briefly, a quiet approval in canine code. Grace exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Each day that week, Arthur repeated the ritual, moving the stool an inch closer, speaking less, breathing more. It wasn't training. It was penance disguised as patience. He wrote down every detail for the county's record: duration, posture, triggers. But the truth was, he wasn't doing it for the board. He was doing it for something inside him that had been trapped behind its own cage for 15 years. By the 6th night, when the lights went out and the corridors fell silent, Arthur remained seated in the kennel hall. He had intended to go home, but his hands trembled when he tried to leave. Sleep never came easy these days. It arrived in bursts of gunfire and radio static. At 3:07 a.m., he gave up. He dug out his old flip phone, its screen cracked, its case scratched with the engraving MP42, a relic from another life. He dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade. After 2 rings, a voice, hoarse and familiar, answered. "Arthur? Jesus, man. You calling from the grave?" "James." Arthur's voice cracked, the way old bridges creak before collapsing. "I need the truth." There was a pause, then a low sigh from the other end. "You're still chasing that, huh?" Arthur leaned against the wall, staring at Shadow sleeping curled in his pen. 15 years, James. 15 years thinking I killed him." "You didn't," James said quietly. "I've told you before." "Not like that," Arthur muttered. "I need it said, out loud. What happened in Helmand? Why the dog ran into that IED? Was it my order?" A long silence. Only static filled the air, thin and sharp like broken glass. Then James spoke, his voice soft with age and memory. "It wasn't your order, Art. He broke from formation when the tripwire snapped. You froze. Hell, we all did. But he moved first. He shoved me down before it blew. Saved my life." Arthur's breath hitched. He disobeyed. "No," James corrected. "He decided. That's the difference. You trained him to protect. And he did." Arthur's eyes closed. "I've been blaming myself all these years." James gave a low laugh, half sorrow, half affection. "Yeah, you have a talent for that. You and those dogs, you carry guilt like it's oxygen. Let it go, Art. You've done enough bleeding." Arthur didn't reply. He hung up slowly, the call fading into silence. For a long while he sat there, staring at nothing, until dawn crept pale through the kennel bars. The next morning, he looked older but lighter, as if some invisible chain had loosened. Grace noticed the difference immediately. "Rough night?" she asked, handing him a thermos. "Long one," he said, "but maybe the first that ended right." They began again. Today's task: contact with the muzzle inside the cage. Arthur attached a short strap of leather to the handle, looped with a small pouch filled with chopped liver. The scent wafted thick and warm. Shadow paced back and forth, tail twitching low. His eyes never left Arthur's hand. Arthur crouched down. "This isn't an order, soldier. It's an invitation." He held the muzzle still until Shadow's nose brushed it again. Then, carefully, the dog's tongue flicked out, found the treat, and stayed. A small click of trust between teeth and leather. Arthur let out a soft, "Good boy," his voice rough with something more than approval. By mid-afternoon, the progress was undeniable. Grace filmed the session from her phone, documenting each minute with the steadiness of a nurse in an operating room. Jared walked in halfway through, surprise flickering behind his tired eyes. "He's wearing it?" "Almost," Grace whispered. "Arthur's doing it his way." Jared leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "County meeting's Monday. You get that video filed, maybe we've got a chance." Outside, the sky dimmed toward dusk, gold bleeding into Stewone, gray. Shadow now wore the muzzle within the cage, loose and empty, but resting on his snout like a fragile peace offering. Arthur slipped the leash through the mesh, clipped it to the collar, and waited. The dog didn't pull away. It was the first time in months anyone had touched him without fear. Arthur's throat tightened. He stepped back, letting the leash hang slack. Duke wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate. Grace smiled softly. "That's your proof." "Not yet," Arthur said. "Tomorrow we try the door." By evening, exhaustion hit him like a tide. For the first time in a week, he decided to drive home instead of sleeping on the shelter cot. He told Grace to lock up and left her the keys to the recording files. She stayed behind a while longer, writing notes by lamplight, listening to the quiet sound of two shepherds breathing at opposite ends of the hall. When she finally turned off the lights, she paused by Shadow's cage. The dog was lying still, muzzle beside him, eyes half closed. "You're doing good," she whispered. "Better than any of us expected." Shadow's ear twitched, and for a brief second, she swore she saw something soft pass through his gaze. A memory, perhaps, or the ghost of loyalty reborn. Outside, snow began to fall again, fine and light, whispering against the roof. That night, as Arthur drove down the empty rural road toward his cabin, the weight of the past began to slip from him, like fog burning off under sunrise. But underneath that easing came something stranger: hollowness. 15 years of self-punishment had defined him. Without it, he felt unanchored, as though he'd traded pain for absence. He reached his cabin at the edge of the pines just before midnight. Duke curled beside the hearth, eyes glowing amber in the firelight. Arthur sat on the old sofa, staring into the flames until his reflection blurred. "You know," he murmured to Duke, "sometimes peace feels like nothing at all." The dog gave a faint sigh, resting his chin on Arthur's boot. In the morning, the world would demand proof, but for now, the war was quiet, at least until the next door opened halfway and asked to be crossed. The storm came without warning, rolling out of the desert like a dark ocean swallowing the horizon. The first wind hit the rescue station with a metallic moan, rattling the loose panels and sweeping sand through every crack. Grace Whitman had just finished logging the latest session footage when lightning split the clouds in half, lighting the kennel hall white as bone. Shadow's reaction was instant: a violent startle, pupils blown wide, ears snapping back. The next thunderclap landed like artillery. The gray-white shepherd lunged against the bars, teeth bared in terror. The sound wasn't growling. It was panic given a voice. "Arthur!" Grace shouted, gripping the latch as the storm's roar filled the room. Arthur Bennett was already moving, boots pounding the floor, Duke at his heels. "He's triggered! Keep back!" he barked, raising a hand. But Shadow slammed against the cage again, harder this time. The old lock, rusted from years of neglect, split with a sharp metallic crack. The door swung open. "Shadow, no!" Arthur's voice vanished into the thunder. In a flash of gray and white, the shepherd bolted through the open door, vanished into the storm-drenched night, his form swallowed by rain and lightning. Arthur sprinted out after him, calling commands into the chaos. "Sitz! Bleib! Shadow!" But the wind shredded his voice into nothing. Duke barked furiously, straining forward, but Arthur's raised hand stopped him. "No, stay!" he ordered, chest heaving. The rain hammered down, cold and blinding. Within seconds, Shadow was gone. By dawn, the storm had spent itself, leaving the land soaked and eerily still. The desert smelled of wet sage and iron. Mud pooled in the yard, and paw prints led away from the station toward the low hills beyond. Arthur hadn't slept. His jacket was still damp, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his mind was locked on the tracks. He followed them out into the morning mist, Duke trotting silently beside him. The prints curved north toward the high ridge of Sonora Mine, a stretch of abandoned shafts and rusted machinery where coyotes nested and dust devils twisted up from the broken earth. He stopped only when the sound of an approaching truck broke the silence. David's white county vehicle pulled up beside him, its tires hissing in the mud. David stepped out, wearing his standard khaki uniform and a fresh bandage visible under the rolled sleeve. His expression was tight, jaw shadowed with stubble, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. A holstered pistol rested at his hip. Arthur's shoulders stiffened. "You brought a gun." David's reply was clipped. "Protocol. Public safety report's been filed. A level 4 escape puts the town on notice. We can't risk him mauling a kid or livestock." Arthur turned fully to face him. "He's not a threat. He's scared." "Doesn't matter." David's voice wavered, but only slightly. "Fear bites too." The wind carried, the smell of wet sand between them. Before either man could speak again, another truck rumbled up the dirt road. Jared climbed out, his parka unzipped, his grizzled beard beaded with rain. The station director's face carried the weary calm of someone forced too often to mediate between conviction and law. "Enough," he said, raising both hands. "I've already talked to the county. I'm freezing the euthanasia order for 24 hours. That's all I can buy you." Arthur blinked. "You did what?" Jared's eyes softened. "I told them we had a plan in motion. If Shadow's retrieved without incident in that window, the report's void." David's brow furrowed. "You overstepped your authority." "And you overreached yours," Jared shot back. "Put that gun away, officer. I'm not losing another dog to fear, or another man to guilt." The silence stretched until Grace appeared behind them, hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes swollen from crying. She carried a thermos and a worn field blanket. "He'll come back," she said quietly, her voice almost trembling. "He always circles back to what feels safe." David shook his head. "You don't know that." But Duke, standing close to her leg, gave a soft huff and nudged her hand as if confirming her belief. The gesture was so gentle, so deliberate, that even David hesitated. Arthur looked at Grace, then at the horizon. "He won't come back here," he said softly. "Not yet. He'll look for cover, somewhere elevated, defensible." Jared frowned. "Like where?" Arthur's eyes lifted toward the distant outline of the old Sonora mine. "Up there. It's high ground. Metal roofs, narrow entries, open sight lines. Perfect place for something trained to hold position under fire." David crossed his arms. "You're saying he's reverting to combat instinct." "I'm saying he's surviving," Arthur replied. Without another word, Arthur turned toward the direction of the mine. He opened the back of his truck, strapped on a headlamp, and loaded his worn leather pack with rope, a flashlight, a canteen, and a rolled-up muzzle. Duke jumped in beside him, tail steady, eyes alert. Grace moved closer. "You can't go alone." Arthur managed a faint smile. "Not alone. I've got him." He nodded to Duke. Grace hesitated, then pressed the thermos into his hand. "Then take this. It's hot." David stepped forward, expression torn between anger and worry. "Arthur, I have to report movement if you find him. Don't make this harder." Arthur paused by the driver's door. "If you trusted dogs half as much as you fear them, you'd understand this isn't about rules anymore." The old engine growled to life. Arthur steered toward the ridge, tires spitting mud as the truck climbed the winding road into the rising fog. The higher he drove, the more the world shrank to gray. When he reached the lower edge of the abandoned mining grounds, the silence was absolute. Only the occasional creak of rusted beams and the whisper of dripping water. The mine loomed above, its entrance a gaping wound in the earth. Arthur parked, stepped out, and switched on his headlamp. The beam cut through the mist, catching flecks of rain and dust. Duke trotted forward, nose to the ground. The dog's muscles tensed. He had found the scent. Arthur followed, one hand resting on Duke's back, moving slowly across the gravel. The path wound past collapsed scaffolds and discarded mining carts. A broken no trespassing sign swung loosely from a chain. "Easy," he murmured. "Steady." The first howl reached him then, a sharp, hollow sound carried by wind and stone. Not a coyote. Lower, rougher. Shadow. Arthur's heart hammered. He followed the sound to a ledge overlooking a shallow pit where rainwater had pooled. There, half silhouetted by his headlamp beam, stood the shepherd, matted fur wet and glinting, chest heaving. "Shadow," Arthur called softly. The dog's ears flicked, eyes reflecting the light, like twin amber coins. Arthur crouched. "It's just me, boy. You're safe." Another rumble of thunder rolled over the ridge. Shadow flinched violently, backing up toward the mine's mouth. Duke let out a low, authoritative bark. One short burst, neither threat nor challenge, but recognition. Shadow froze. Arthur extended the leash slowly. "Come on, soldier. Time to come home." The shepherd hesitated, tremors rippling through his frame. The muzzle hung loose from Arthur's hand, glinting wet. For a moment, neither man nor beast moved. Then, step by careful step, Shadow began to walk forward. When his paw touched the leash, the clouds above cracked open again, lightning tearing through the ridge. The boom hit like cannon fire. Shadow yelped, twisting sideways, the leash snapping taut. His collar caught on a broken pipe jutting from the wall with a sharp metallic ping. "Hold on!" Arthur shouted, lunging forward. He dropped to his knees, grabbing for the collar, but it snapped free, the metal buckle splitting. Shadow bolted again, this time vanishing deeper into the mine's mouth. Arthur swore under his breath, chest heaving, then turned to Duke. "We're not done yet." Rain began to fall again, harder now, thundering against the rusted tin roofs. The desert storm was back, fierce and unrelenting. Arthur adjusted his headlamp and followed Duke into the dark, the beam slicing through dust and echoing water, the mine's shadows closing in like memories that refused to die. And somewhere ahead, a frightened soldier ran deeper into the dark, carrying not just the weight of fear, but the last chance of redemption for the man who refused to let him go. Rain had turned the desert floor into a slurry of mud and gravel, and the sky pressed low, gray and swollen, as if it too held its breath. Arthur Bennett stood at the mouth of the old Sonora mine, a beam of his headlamp piercing into darkness that breathed dust and echoes. Duke trotted beside him, fur damp, tail held low but steady, a veteran's composure. The wind carried a hollow whine through the rusted shafts, followed by a single broken bark. "Shadow," Arthur whispered, leaning forward. The sound had come from deep within. He stepped carefully into the mouth of the mine, boots scraping on rock. The passage narrowed quickly, walls closing in, ceiling dripping from the night's rain. Each step down felt like stepping back through time. Duke followed, paws soundless, ears flicking toward every distant rattle. Halfway down the second tunnel, the ground trembled slightly, a small collapse somewhere deeper. The air grew heavy with the smell of rust, oil, and wet stone. Arthur's lamp caught something in the dust ahead, a faint smear of blood, leading toward a crevice where the floor split open. He moved closer, dropping to one knee. That's when he heard it again, the strained, desperate whine of a dog trapped in pain. "Hang on," Arthur said, his voice cracking. He lay flat on his stomach and shone the light down into the gap. There, maybe 15 feet below, Shadow was wedged between two rusted steel girders. One hind leg was caught under a twisted frame, the fur matted with blood. The shepherd's eyes flashed up at him through the darkness, wild, terrified, but alive. Arthur's heart seized. "Good boy. Stay still. I've got you." The drop wasn't sheer, but the slope was treacherous, littered with crumbling rock and old mining debris. He unclipped the coil of rope from his pack, but found no anchor strong enough. The beams around him were corroded, one kick away from failure. He looked at Duke. "Stay here, no matter what." The dog whined low, pacing once before settling near the edge, eyes locked on him. Arthur looped the rope around his waist, fastened the other end to a rusted cartwheel, and began his descent. The slope gave way under his boots, sending shards of gravel slicing through his palms. He caught himself on a jutting ledge, breath ragged. The smell of blood grew stronger. When he reached the bottom, Shadow thrashed once, crying out in pain. Arthur's voice softened to a whisper. "Easy, soldier. You're not alone." The shepherd stilled, trembling but silent. Arthur crouched beside him, inspecting the trapped leg. The steel beam had shifted during the collapse, wedging the joint in a cruel angle. He tugged at it, but it didn't move. His flashlight beam flickered, throwing their shadows against the rock walls. One man, one dog, both fighting ghosts of command and failure. "All right," Arthur muttered, unbuckling his leather belt. "We'll make this work." He looped the belt around the beam's base, braced his boots against the rock, and pulled. The pain ripped through his hands, reopening the cuts from earlier. But the metal didn't budge. "Come on!" he grunted through his teeth. "Move, damn it!" The beam gave a single metallic creak, then shifted half an inch. Shadow yelped as his leg came free, collapsing onto his side. Arthur crawled closer, hands shaking, and wrapped his jacket under the injured limb to stop the bleeding. "You're all right now," he whispered. "You're all right." But the relief was short-lived. When he looked up, the slope above them shimmered with movement. Small slides of gravel trickling down. The rain outside was feeding into the mine, loosening everything. They were trapped at the bottom of a slow collapse. Arthur looked up at the dark path. "We're climbing, Shadow. You and me." He looped the belt around the dog's chest, pulling gently. Shadow struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg. Arthur led him upward, gripping the slick rock with torn fingers. Every few steps the ground crumbled beneath them, sending sparks of stone and metal down the pit. Halfway up, Arthur slipped. His body slammed hard against the wall, breath leaving him in a violent gasp. The flashlight flew from his hand, clattering into the dark below. He clung to the slope, knuckles white, legs trembling. "Up!" he barked through gritted teeth, voice hoarse. "Up, Shadow!" The shepherd hesitated, whining, but then turned back, stepping down toward him. "Go!" Arthur rasped, but Shadow didn't obey. Instead, the dog wedged himself against the slope, shoulder braced against the falling debris. A chunk of stone broke free above and struck his flank, but he didn't move. He stood there, steadying the loose gravel with his weight, eyes locked on Arthur. Arthur's breath caught. "You stubborn bastard," he whispered. "Up!" he ordered again, louder this time. The dog pushed upward inch by inch, dragging his injured leg. Arthur followed, bleeding, hand over hand, until they were nearly at the rim. That was when another slide tore loose, the slope giving way in a rush of rock and rusted wire. Arthur lost his grip. For a second he was falling again, but then Duke appeared at the top, his massive body lunging forward. The older shepherd barked once and scrambled halfway down, digging his paws into the crumbling edge. "Duke, no!" Arthur shouted, but the dog ignored him, bracing his front legs wide and lowering his weight. Arthur reached for him. The rope around his waist caught on a protruding rock, jerking him sideways. He swung toward the edge where Duke's muzzle appeared, teeth gripping the rope's frayed end. "Hold!" Arthur gasped. For a heartbeat that seemed eternal, the world hung still, the two dogs straining, one above, one beside, the man caught between them. And then, with one final surge, Shadow scrambled up, pressing his body under Arthur's shoulder as Duke hauled back. The trio burst free of the pit, collapsing in a tangled heap on the flat ground outside. The storm had passed. The air was heavy and silent except for the sound of panting and rain dripping from the roof. Arthur rolled onto his back, staring at the gray sky through the broken opening. His hands were shredded, blood smeared across his wrists, but he was laughing. Weak, disbelieving laughter. Shadow lay beside him, chest heaving, muzzle streaked with mud. Duke flopped down at his other side, tail thumping once before going still. "Good boys," Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. "Both of you." When he finally sat up, lights flashed from the distance, headlights cutting through fog. Jared's truck bounced over the wet road, with David close behind in the county vehicle. Grace was there too, wrapped in a long coat, hair plastered to her cheeks. They ran toward him, splashing through the puddles. "Oh God, Arthur!" Grace cried, dropping to her knees beside him. He shook his head weakly. "We're all right." David, pale and wide-eyed, froze when he saw Shadow limping at Arthur's side, muzzle still clipped to his collar. For a moment, his hand twitched toward his belt, but then he stopped. The shepherd stood quietly, leaning slightly against Arthur's leg, leash loose. No growling, no panic, just exhaustion and obedience. David swallowed hard, then crouched and opened his medical kit. "Hold still," he said quietly. His voice carried no authority now, only regret. "You'll get infection if I don't wrap these." Arthur nodded. "Thanks." As David worked, the storm began to break apart in the distance. Grace watched, tears running freely down her face. She reached out and brushed Shadow's head. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch. Jared exhaled, long and heavy. "That's all the proof we'll need." Arthur smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at his mouth. "Maybe not proof for the county," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "but proof for him." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage and rust. The mine loomed behind them like a monument to survival. And there, beneath the fading clouds, 3 lives that had been broken by fear found their breath again. Fragile, bloody, but alive. The first snow came late that year, thin, powdery, and hesitant, like a child testing the quiet. The wind across Silver Bend was gentler now, brushing against rooftops that no longer trembled under thunder. Outside the rescue outpost by the dry creek, Arthur Bennett stood beside a small wooden stool, its 3 legs uneven but firm. His gloves were patched. His palms still bore pale scars from the mine, yet his grip was steady as he set the stool down on the cold concrete. Duke, the weathered German shepherd with amber eyes, sat nearby, tail curled, watching the small circle of volunteers gather in the morning mist. The building itself had once been a maintenance shed, a forgotten adjunct to the town's rescue station. Arthur had turned it into something new, a space for healing that he simply called the behavioral post. Inside, a faint smell of lavender hung in the air, mixing with the dry scent of timber. On one wall hung a modest sign hand-painted by Grace, "Stillness saves lives." Grace Langford, 58, moved between the benches with a calm that carried years of quiet strength. Her hair, streaked silver and brown, was tied loosely at the nape and her eyes held the kind of patience that only those who've lost deeply can bear. Widowhood had not hardened her. It had softened her voice to a kind of music that steadied those around her. She placed mugs of steaming coffee on a low table and smiled when Arthur caught her eye. "They'll learn more from watching you than any manual," she said. Arthur chuckled. "They'll learn faster if Duke doesn't fall asleep halfway through." The volunteers laughed. Among them was a young man named Eli Torres, 26, a local mechanic's apprentice with grease still staining the lines of his hands. He had brought his mixed-breed hound, Luna, a speckled brown and white dog of nervous energy and eager eyes. Next to him, Mrs. Reynolds, a retired nurse in her 70s, held the leash of a timid shepherd mix named Scout, whose ribs showed faintly beneath his winter coat. There was even old Mr. Jensen, 80 and thin as a wire, who came without a dog at all but said, with a grin missing 2 teeth, that sometimes people need the training more. Arthur stood in front of them, adjusting his scarf. "We'll start simple," he said. "No commands yet. No words. Just the stool." He sat down slowly, his back straight, his breath even. Duke mirrored him, sitting, then lowering his head to rest between his paws. Around them, the group followed. For a moment, only the sound of breathing filled the air. "Dogs read us before they hear us," Arthur said softly. "They learn the rhythm of calm. When you sit, you teach them that the world doesn't always demand motion." Luna, the young hound, fidgeted at first, tugging at her leash. Eli frowned, whispering a "sit" that came out sharp. Arthur raised a hand. "Let her find it," he murmured. "You can't force quiet into another heart." Minutes passed. The winter sun broke weakly through the clouds, painting the frost in gold. And then Luna sighed and lowered herself beside Eli's boots, her body unclenching like a wound exhaling pain. "That's it," Arthur said, his voice roughened with pride. "That's the moment. You sit down, so they can stand again." Behind him, Grace smiled, the kind of smile that warmed more than coffee could. Weeks turned into a rhythm of mornings filled with soft commands and the sound of paws on concrete. Arthur and Duke became fixtures in the town's routine. Every dawn before the others arrived, he would walk the perimeter with Duke, checking the fence, breathing the cold air. The scars on his hands no longer hurt. They had become reminders of something worth keeping. One morning, as frost crusted the lavender pots by the door, Grace arrived early carrying a small wooden crate. "For the porch," she said. Inside were sprigs of dried lavender, a gift from her late husband's garden. Arthur took the crate, their fingers brushing. "You keep giving me reasons to stay," he murmured. Grace met his gaze with a soft, knowing look. "And you keep finding ways to rebuild what others left broken." They didn't speak of love, not directly. Instead, they spoke of small things, the right grain of wood for the new stool, the best blend for morning coffee, how Duke preferred the left side of the porch. But in those quiet exchanges, something steady took root. That night, as the wind moaned over the hills, they shared a thermos of coffee inside the dimly lit cabin beside the outpost. The single bulb above them buzzed faintly. Duke snored near the door, and Grace leaned back against the wall, her eyes on the fading glow of the lantern. "You ever think," she whispered, "that peace is just learning not to run from the silence?" Arthur smiled, his voice low. "I used to think it was winning every fight. Now I think it's staying still long enough to let the noise settle." The next morning brought news that reached beyond Silver Bend. A video had surfaced online, a simple clip taken by a county officer. Shadow, the once feared K9, now walking calmly beside a handler, muzzle on, tail relaxed. The caption read, "Rehabilitation isn't the end, it's the start." The footage was brief but powerful. Within days, messages poured into the town office. James Carver, a Denver-based philanthropist and veteran advocate, contacted Arthur directly. James was a tall man in his mid-40s, his face lean but kind, eyes shadowed by memories of his own tours overseas. A former Army medic, he carried himself with the quiet grace of one who'd seen too much, but chose to heal instead of hate. He called Arthur through a scratchy line that carried the hum of a distant city. "I saw what you did with that dog," James said. "I'm starting a fund, Warriors and Friends. It'll connect veterans with rescue dogs facing trauma. First donations already in your name." Arthur sat silently for a moment, throat tightening. "You're giving that credit to the wrong man," he said finally. "No," James replied. "I'm giving it to the right kind of man." After the call, Arthur stepped outside. Snowflakes drifted down, soft and slow, melting against Duke's fur. He looked up at the pale sky, feeling something both weightless and rooted. The mine, the storms, the blood, all of it had led here, to stillness and second chances. Grace joined him with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "You look like you're seeing ghosts again," she teased. "Maybe," Arthur said, "but they're smiling this time." By midwinter, the outpost had become a place of pilgrimage. Elderly townsfolk would visit in their heavy coats, clutching thermoses, sitting quietly as Arthur and Duke demonstrated gentle handling with the new dogs. Hound rescues, shepherd mixes, even an old collie whose hearing was fading, but whose spirit wasn't. The echo of wooden stools against the floor made a soft rhythm like bells calling the morning to prayer. When one child asked why Arthur never replaced the cracked stool he used, he smiled and said, "Because it remembers what broke it. That's how it stands." The lavender by the porch had bloomed faintly despite the cold, its scent mingling with the crisp air. Every afternoon, Grace would tend to it, Duke sitting nearby, and Arthur repairing the fencing or sanding another stool. They were simple scenes, but in them lived an entire theology of patience and love. Sometimes, when the wind carried a whisper through the valley, it sounded almost like the command that had saved his life in the mine: up. Only now, it wasn't a cry of survival. It was a promise. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Arthur, Grace, and Duke sat together on the porch. The stool rested beside them, its 3 legs scarred and smooth, lavender brushing against it in the breeze. The world was still. Arthur took Grace's hand. "We don't have to chase what's gone," he said softly. "We just have to stay for what remains." She smiled. "And that's enough?" He looked toward the horizon, where the snow caught fire in the last light. "More than enough." Duke stirred, laying his head on Arthur's boot. The sound of his steady breathing filled the fading day, and for once Arthur didn't feel the urge to move, to fix, or to flee. He simply sat, an old man beside a loyal dog, and a woman who'd learned, as he had, that peace was not found in running, but in resting. The stool creaked gently in the cold, like the earth itself sighing in relief. And there, in the amber dusk of Silver Bend, they sat down so they could stand again. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles wrapped in thunder or light. He sends them quietly, in the shape of an old man who refuses to give up, and a broken dog who dares to trust again. Arthur didn't just save Shadow. He witnessed the small, steady miracle that happens when love outlasts fear, the kind of grace that mends what the world calls beyond repair. And maybe that's what faith really is, not waiting for heaven to open, but learning to see heaven in the gentle breath beside you, in the loyal eyes that refuse to look away, in every chance to sit down, forgive, and begin again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a prayer in the comments for every veteran, for every lost soul finding their way home, and for every loyal dog who once saved a human heart. May God bless you, and may His quiet miracles find you wherever you are tonight.